In this video, we will be discussing the populist movement of the late 19th century. Farmers were struggling in this new economy and wanted to push for democratic and economic reforms. This reform movement lays the groundwork for the massive changes of the progressive era in the 20th century. It ends with a fundamental political shift that will have ramifications that will last until the Great Depression of the 1930s. The Stalwarts were a faction of the Republican Party that existed briefly during the 1870s and 1880s. Led by U.S. Senator Roscoe Conkling, they were the traditional Republicans who opposed Rutherford B. Hayes' civil service reform. Stalwarts were mostly Southerners from urban areas. Politically, they were more aligned with the Democrats, and they tended to share voters. They were pitted against the half-breeds, or moderates, for control of the Republican Party. The most prominent issue between Stalwarts and half-breeds was patronage, or the handing out of government civil service jobs to political supporters. The half-breeds opposed this policy and worked to get civil service reform, and finally created the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act. James Garfield clashed with Republican leaders over patronage appointments to his administration. Garfield was eager to escape the capital for a summer trip to New England, where he planned to give a speech at his alma mater, Williams College. Like most presidents up to that point, he was not accompanied by bodyguards or security detail. Charles Guiteau fired 2 shots at the president from point-blank range. The first bullet only grazed Garfield's right arm. The second shot was more accurate, striking Garfield in the lower back and knocking him to the floor. Charles Guiteau was a staunch Republican and had wrangled a personal meeting with Garfield earlier, during which he gave the president a copy of his speech and asked to be rewarded with a consulship in Paris. When he was denied a government office, Guiteau's mind turned to revenge. Guiteau became convinced that Garfield's death would save the country by allowing Vice President Chester A. Arthur to take his place. Doctors were unable to save Garfield's life, and he died on September 19, 1881, after only 200 days in office. Guiteau was captured, tried, and executed by hanging. Signed into law by President Chester A. Arthur, the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act creates a merit-based system of awarding federal government jobs. It was passed to address the widespread use of patronage, or the spoils system, where jobs were awarded to political or financial supporters. It required applicants for government positions to pass a competitive exam, and it made it illegal to fire or demote government employees for political reasons. A major reason for the passage of the law was the assassination of President Garfield, who was killed by a deranged person seeking a job. Today, over 90% of federal employees are covered by the Pendleton Act. The law was very important in creating a professional civil service at the federal level and establishing the modern bureaucracy. It also changed the way political parties financed their campaigns, forcing them to look to wealthy donors for funding. As you see in the cartoon, President Arthur is throwing out titles of political offices to a crowd of men. This is a commentary on the Pendleton Civil Service Act. The term soft soap is seen in the cartoon, which refers to trying to persuade. Arthur is using jobs to persuade people, something that the Pendleton Act is supposed to prevent. The 1884 presidential election was a highly contested race between Democratic Governor Grover Cleveland of New York and former Secretary of State James G. Blaine. The most important issue in the 1884 campaign was the issue of personal character. Cleveland was attacked for an alleged illicit affair, and Blaine was accused of taking money from businesses while in Congress. Another factor that influenced the election was a group known as the Mugwumps, a group of Republican political activists who switched parties from the Republican Party by supporting Grover Cleveland. They switched because they rejected the financial corruption associated with Blaine's candidacy. They proved to be the difference in New York and helped swing the election in Cleveland's favor. After years of big business eliminating competition, the federal government decided to cast aside its laissez-faire policies and begin to regulate the economy. In 1890, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act. It was the first time the government attempted to prohibit trusts. The Sherman Antitrust Act authorized the federal government to dissolve trusts and punish individuals involved in the unfair elimination of competition. It was designed to restore competition, but it was loosely worded and failed to define terms like trusts and monopoly. The Supreme Court dismantled the Sherman Antitrust Act in the decision United States versus E.C. Knight Company. The court ruled that manufacturing could not be regulated by the federal government. The ruling effectively eliminated any government regulation of trusts. In the 1880s, tariffs were a major political issue. The tariff had two main goals. It was a major source of funds for the federal government, and they provided protection for American companies from foreign competition. The tariff was an issue that divided the nation. Manufacturers tended to support higher tariffs, while farmers who exported a great deal of their products opposed it. Republicans generally supported the tariff, while the Democrats opposed it. The McKinley Tariff of 1890 boosted protective tariff rates by almost 50% for many foreign products. At the same time, it also eliminated tariffs on sugar, molasses, tea, and coffee. While many business owners supported the tariff, American consumers generally opposed it because it increased overall prices for goods. American farmers were very aware of the economic climate as it affected them deeply. They were looking to the federal government for assistance in dealing with the problems associated with the new modern economy. Like factory workers, American farmers have tried for many years to organize to address the problems plaguing them. The Granger Movement was a group of farmers, mainly in Midwestern and Southern states, that worked to increase farming profits after the Civil War. Farmers had gone deeply into debt to purchase land and machinery. Railroads had become regional monopolies and charged farmers excessive rates to transport their crops to market. Farmers began to organize locally for educational and social purposes. The Grange served as political forums to protest the constantly increasing prices for transporting and storing their products. State legislatures, starting with Illinois, started passing Granger laws, regulating railroads and grain storage companies by setting maximum rates they could charge. Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa soon followed. Railroads and grain companies challenged these Granger laws in court. In 1877, the Supreme Court upheld the Granger laws in Munn v. Illinois. The Supreme Court ruled that businesses serving the public interest could be regulated by the government. It set an important precedent that led to the modern federal regulatory process. About 10 years later, the Supreme Court would change course and severely limit the rights of states to control interstate commerce in the Wabash v. Illinois ruling. The Supreme Court ruled in that case that Illinois' Granger law was unconstitutional because it sought to control interstate commerce, a power reserved to the federal government by the 10th Amendment. In the years following the Civil War, railroads were privately owned and entirely unregulated. Railroad companies held a natural monopoly in the areas that only they serviced. Monopolies are generally viewed as harmful because they prevent the competition that determines the price and quality of products and services offered to the public. The railroad monopolies had the power to set prices and control the market. In response to the Wabash v. Illinois decision in 1886, Congress enacted the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887. The Interstate Commerce Act made the railroads the first industry subject to federal regulation. It established the Interstate Commerce Commission, a 5-member enforcement board, which set the guidelines on how railroads could do business. It required reasonable rates, banned rebates and differential freight rates, pools, and other methods of eliminating competition. Unfortunately, many of the terms of the law were contradictory, and federal courts made the law ineffective. As the Granger movement seemed to die out, its successor began to form as early as 1875 with the organization of Farmers' Alliances. This movement of the 1870s and 1880s sought to improve the economic conditions of farmers through the creation of cooperatives and political action. The National Farmers Alliance, or the Northern Alliance, fought to eliminate grain transport monopolies. They were made up of mostly Republicans and some blacks. They formed a national organization with chapters in several states. In the South, most farmers were sharecroppers who didn't own their own land and were stuck in perpetual debt. The Southern Alliance started in Texas and expanded throughout the state, becoming the Texas State Farmers Alliance. It grew into the National Farmers Alliance and Industrial Union, also known as the Southern Alliance. They were made up of entirely Democrats and banned African American farmers from joining. Farmers' Alliances set up cooperative stores that sold goods at lower prices than retail stores and established cooperative mills and storehouses to help cut costs to farmers. Eventually, these groups became political. They supported government regulation of railroads and telegraph companies, an increase in the money supply, a graduated income tax, lower tariffs, and other major regulations. While the Farmers' Alliance were able to achieve some victories at the local level, they were unable to effect any change at the national level.